Snow hammered the Ardennes like a fist from the sky. Thick, blinding, merciless. In the ruins of a collapsed Belgian hamlet, a dozen German prisoners huddled beneath a broken barn roof, their breath rising in white clouds, their bodies shaking from terror as much as cold. They had been captured only an hour earlier, dragged from the splintered tree line where their battered unit finally collapsed under American fire. The storm muffled every sound, turning rifles, boots, and voices into distant echoes. Yet inside the barn, fear pulsed so loudly it seemed to fill the air. One prisoner, barely 20, cheeks hollow, eyes sunk deep, kept whispering fragments of a prayer he could no longer finish. Another clutched his frozen hands together, lips trembling as if expecting execution at any moment. They had heard the stories. Every German in the Bulge had. American forces were done taking chances. Done tolerating disguised infiltrators. Done risking their men for the sake of trust. And so these prisoners knelt, convinced that capture in this brutal winter meant their final hour had arrived. Their faces carried defeat, exhaustion, and something darker, resignation. The barn door groaned open. A gust of icy wind swept in, scattering loose straw. Footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, heavy. A single American sergeant stepped inside, brushing snow from his shoulders before locking eyes with the prisoners. Sergeant Daniel Hayes. Hardened by months of fighting, carrying the grief of a brother lost in Normandy, and worn down by the relentless cruelty of the Ardennes winter. He paused, letting the silence grow thick. The prisoners bowed their heads, waiting. One begged softly in broken English. Another squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for what he believed was coming next. Hayes moved forward. Each step crunched through frozen straw. He stopped in front of the youngest prisoner, the one whose voice had trembled with prayer. The boy's breath hitched. His hands shook violently. Hayes knelt. The barn seemed to freeze in place. And instead of raising his weapon, he unbuckled his canteen. He lifted the prisoner's chin with a gloved hand and placed the canteen in his trembling grasp. "Drink," Hayes said quietly. The German boy stared, stunned into stillness. The others looked up, disbelief breaking through fear. In the middle of a winter stained with suspicion, blood, and desperation, the American sergeant had chosen mercy. Outside, artillery rumbled faintly across the forest. Inside, something shifted, something small, human, unexpected. A moment that none of them would ever forget. A moment that would ripple far beyond that shattered barn. And it began with a single act of mercy in a place where mercy had almost frozen out of existence. Winter 1944 carved itself into the memories of every soldier who walked, crawled, or bled through it. The Ardennes forest, normally quiet, normally beautiful, had transformed into a frozen labyrinth of shattered trees, buried roads, and ghostly fog. Temperatures plunged so low that rifles jammed, boots stiffened, and breath crystallized instantly in the air. This was the backdrop for Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. A desperate, violent strike meant to fracture the Allied front, recapture critical ground, and force a negotiation before the entire German war machine collapsed. It came without warning. American units resting in what they believed were safe forests awoke to thunder. Tanks emerging from the mist, artillery raining down, entire divisions struck as though the forest itself had turned against them. For days the line buckled. Towns like St. Vith, Houffalize, and Bastogne became roaring furnaces of conflict, filled with chaos, confusion, and heroism. Amid the mayhem, thousands of German soldiers started to surrender. Some because their ammunition ran dry. Some because their officers had been killed. Others because they saw the offensive failing and wanted to survive the winter. But surrendering didn't feel safe. Not anymore. Rumors pulsed through German ranks like a second heartbeat. The Americans had uncovered German commandos wearing stolen uniforms. Sabotage teams had redirected convoys, switched road signs, and infiltrated checkpoints. Suspicion spread like wildfire. And when suspicion enters a battlefield, humanity becomes fragile. Every prisoner was questioned. Every accent analyzed. Every ID checked twice. Sometimes 3 times. The winter sharpened everyone's nerves. On the American side, men were exhausted beyond reason. They had marched through freezing winds, fought ambushes in whiteout conditions, and watched friends collapse from cold more often than bullets. Tension coiled inside every foxhole. Even veteran soldiers struggled to separate fear from caution. Into this burning cold stepped Sergeant Daniel Hayes, 34 years old. A man shaped by the quiet fields of Ohio and the violence of Normandy. A soldier who had learned to fight without letting hatred consume the last part of him that still felt human. His younger brother, Tom, had been killed by German fire during the breakout from the beaches. The folded flag still lived in Hayes' duffel, creased, worn, but carried everywhere like a weight he refused to set down. Yet unlike many, he never let grief turn into cruelty. When his unit pushed through the outskirts of a ruined Belgian hamlet, the sky hung heavy with storm clouds. The village seemed abandoned, buried under snow and shattered beams. But from behind the wreckage of a collapsed cottage emerged a cluster of German soldiers. Hands raised high, faces drained of blood. One of them couldn't have been older than 19. His helmet was gone. His hair clumped with frozen sweat. His breath came in quick, desperate bursts. Hayes' men raised their rifles. The Germans fell to their knees immediately. No orders shouted. No resistance. Just defeat, raw and absolute. One prisoner pleaded softly for mercy, voice trembling in the quiet. Another muttered that they didn't want to die. The youngest kept whispering a prayer, repeating the same words again and again as if trying to keep fear from swallowing him whole. The world outside was all violence. Inside that barn, something quieter lingered, uncertainty, fear, humanity hanging by a thread. Hayes stepped forward, his boots sinking into snow and crushed straw. His men watched closely, expecting him to be as wary as they were. Expecting strictness. Expecting coldness. Instead, he did something no one predicted. And what happened in that small barn, between enemies, between men shaped by war, would become a moment that reshaped how both sides remembered that winter. A moment when the war's frost cracked, revealing something warmer beneath. Something fragile, but unmistakable. Something that refused to die, even in a season made of ice and suffering. The storm outside hardened through the night, turning every window and crack in the barn into a whistle of freezing air. The American platoon had positioned themselves around the perimeter, rifles ready, nerves stretched thin. No one trusted the quiet. No one trusted the snow. And no one trusted the men kneeling inside the barn wearing field gray. Sergeant Hayes stood near the doorway, watching his breath cloud and vanish. His mind replayed the last 72 hours with brutal clarity. Ambushes in the pine forest, comrades lost in the blizzard, whispers of German infiltrators wearing American jackets and speaking perfect English. It was a winter where the enemy could be anyone. A winter where hesitation cost lives. Yet when he had seen the prisoners, young, starving, hollowed out, something inside him hesitated. Not out of weakness, but recognition. The war had been long enough to teach him that the faces of enemies were often the faces of boys who didn't choose the fight. His brother had known that too. Tom had written it in his last letter home. Most of them looked just as scared as us. Hayes hadn't forgotten. Inside the barn, the German prisoners whispered among themselves in strained voices. The oldest of them, a sergeant with a scar across his nose, watched the Americans with the cautious eyes of a man who expected cruelty. Beside him, the 19-year-old boy who had received Hayes' canteen held it tightly as though it were the last warm thing in a frozen world. His hands wrapped around the metal, cradling it like a lifeline. The boy's name was Emile. Hayes didn't know it yet, but he could see the dread in the young man's expression, the way he flinched at every loud noise, the way his breathing spiked whenever boots approached. Across the hamlet, distant artillery rolled like angry thunder. The front was shifting again. German armored units were pressing through the forest. American lines were rearranging. Everything was unstable. And unstable meant dangerous. Lieutenant Harris approached Hayes from behind, his face red from the wind, his helmet rim lined with frost. "We need to move the prisoners," he said quietly. "HQ wants everyone processed. They're worried about infiltrators slipping through." Hayes nodded. We'll take them at first light. First light. Harris frowned. Why not now? Hayes looked at the barn roof dripping meltwater onto the shivering prisoners. Half the squad can't feel their fingers. I'm not marching anyone through this storm until they can stand without collapsing. Harris opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He had learned long ago that Hayes didn't speak without thought. The lieutenant stepped back outside, leaving Hayes alone with his own thoughts. When Hayes returned inside, he noticed the tension shift. The German sergeant stood up stiffly and raised his hands higher, as if expecting Hayes to strike him. Those wide, fearful stares stung more than cruel words. These men truly believed the Americans might kill them. And Hayes understood why. Stories traveled fast through a frozen front. Some true, some twisted, some born from fear. A massacre here, a retaliation there. Justice blurred easily during winter warfare. Hayes crouched near the youngest prisoner. "You speak English?" he asked quietly. The boy shook his head quickly, terrified to respond incorrectly. Hayes tried again, slower. "Water, more." Emile blinked. His fear cracked slightly. He nodded once. Hayes passed him another canteen. The Germans exchanged glances, confused, wary, surprised. From the opposite corner of the barn, Corporal Jenkins muttered to a fellow guard, "Why's Sarge babying them? They didn't show us mercy out there." Hayes heard it. He stood. "Jenkins." The corporal stiffened. "Yes, Sarge." "War's already taken enough from us," Hayes said, his voice low but firm. "I'm not giving it anything more than I have to. Not today." Jenkins said nothing after that. The night dragged on. The storm raged. And the barn became a fragile island of tense coexistence. American guards pacing with rifles, German prisoners whispering prayers, Hayes moving between them like a bridge neither side understood. Just after midnight, a distant explosion shook the ground. Snow dust rained from the rafters, and the prisoners shrank back instinctively. Hayes stepped outside. The hamlet was silent except for wind. But far off, glowing flares rose into the night sky. Yellow, then red. That meant movement. That meant danger. Within minutes, scouts returned breathless, announcing that a German patrol was approaching from the east, likely unaware the hamlet was in American hands. Harris sprinted to the barn. "Hayes, we have to reposition. If they stumble onto us and see prisoners, this whole thing turns into a slaughter." Hayes knew he was right. The Germans outside would attack on sight, and the prisoners inside would be trapped between two forces, their own and their captors. The Americans readied their positions. The barn door was barred. Lanterns dimmed. Every rifle loaded. Inside the darkness, the German prisoners felt the fear rise again. Emile clutched the canteen Hayes had given him, whispering to the older sergeant, "They are preparing. They think our men are coming." The older German nodded grimly. "If our patrol enters this village, they will shoot first. They will not know we are here." Emile swallowed hard. What will the Americans do? The older man didn't answer. Minutes passed like hours. The wind howled between the broken walls. Snow piled at the thresholds. In the distance, boots crunched and metal clinked, unmistakable signs of German troops moving closer. A battle was about to ignite, and in the middle of it sat a dozen prisoners who could not defend themselves. Hayes paced once, twice, his breath visible, his thoughts racing. He could let the prisoners remain inside, hidden, silent, hope the Germans passed through. But if they spotted movement, or footprints, or shadows, the Americans would fire. The Germans outside would return fire. The prisoners inside would be caught in the crossfire. Hayes made a decision that stunned both sides. He turned to his men. "Open the barn. They're coming in. Get the prisoners behind us." "Behind us?" Jenkins said, shocked. "Sarge, they're the enemy." "Tonight," Hayes said, "they're unarmed men caught in the wrong place. And I'll be damned if I let either side mow them down because of blind fear." It was a choice that defied every instinct of war. But Hayes was about to prove that humanity, once awakened, could be just as powerful as any weapon on the battlefield. The barn door creaked open just enough for Hayes to slip outside. Snow blew across the village like drifting smoke, swallowing light, muffling sound. The American perimeter formed quickly, rifles raised, eyes squinting through the blizzard. Behind them, tucked into the darkest corner of the barn, the German prisoners pressed close together, trembling not just from cold but from the unknown. The approaching patrol grew louder, boots grinding ice, muffled voices speaking rushed German, metal clinking as if rifles were being checked again and again. They weren't moving cautiously, they believed the hamlet was still in German hands. That made them faster and far more dangerous. Lieutenant Harris hissed, "They'll walk right into us." Hayes didn't answer. He watched shadows stretch and distort across the snow. A dozen figures emerged, barely visible through the storm, heads lowered against the wind. Their commander barked something that carried sharply in the cold. Another explosion rumbled miles away. The patrol halted, scanning the ruins. Every American soldier tightened their grip. Hayes stepped forward. "Hold your fire. Hold." Jenkins choked. "Sarge, they're armed and ready." "Hold," Hayes repeated, louder this time. Something inside him refused to let the night turn into another meaningless slaughter. Too much blood had been spilled across those frozen fields, enough to bury any remaining humanity. Yet Hayes felt an instinct stronger than fear, stronger than hatred. He walked out from behind the cover of the collapsed cottage. Alone. Harris grabbed his arm. "You walk out there, they'll shoot you before you even speak." "I'm not letting them wander into a blind fight," Hayes said, pulling free. "Not with prisoners behind us." He stepped into the open. The storm swallowed him whole. The German patrol jolted the moment his silhouette appeared. Rifles snapped upward in one instant motion, a dozen barrels aimed straight at his chest. Their commander shouted a warning. Several soldiers shifted nervously, fingers tightening on triggers. Hayes lifted both hands slowly. He didn't shout. He didn't gesture wildly. He simply stood there, calm, steady, unflinching. The patrol hesitated. No commander expected a lone American sergeant to walk straight into their path without backup. Their leader took a step forward, shouting again, demanding identification, demanding answers. Hayes couldn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. He pointed over his shoulder toward the barn. The German commander froze, confused. Hayes pointed again. Then he pressed his palms out, signaling stop. The wind roared between them. The moment stretched tight like wire. One twitch, one misunderstanding, one burst of panic, and the entire snow-covered village would explode in gunfire. Then the oldest German prisoner inside the barn did something none of the Americans anticipated. He stepped outside, unarmed, hands raised, eyes locked directly on the patrol. Behind him, the other prisoners followed, quiet, slow, terrified, but determined. Emil came last, still clutching Hayes' canteen like a shield. The patrol's rifles wavered. The prisoners spoke rapidly in German, voices frantic, pleading, explaining everything in one breath. Hayes didn't know their words, but he could feel the shift in the air. The patrol's tension cracked. Their rifles lowered inch by inch. Confusion replaced suspicion. The German commander finally understood. These were his own men. Alive. Safe. Protected by an American sergeant who could have used them as shields, or abandoned them, or worse, executed them in the chaos of winter war. Instead, he had chosen mercy. The German commander's jaw tightened. His eyes softened with a mixture of disbelief and something like shame. He nodded once. Slow, respectful. Hayes nodded back. The storm settled into a quiet hum around them. For a moment, it felt as though the war had paused entirely. No gunshots. No orders. No headed. Only exhausted men standing in the snow, staring at one another across an invisible line that, for a brief moment, didn't matter. Then the German commander made a decision. He signaled his men to retreat. Not advance. Retreat. He turned away, leading his patrol back into the white haze, leaving the prisoners behind with their captors. The Americans watched silently, stunned by what had just unfolded. As the figures vanished into the blizzard, Hayes let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Inside the barn, the prisoners sagged to the ground, overwhelmed by the miracle they had just witnessed. Emile approached Hayes slowly, eyes glistening. He extended the canteen with trembling hands, not to keep it, but to return it. Hayes pushed it gently back toward him. Keep it. For a moment, the boy simply stared. Then a small, grateful smile broke through his exhaustion. The storm still howled. The war still raged. But in that shattered hamlet, mercy had carved out a space of its own, a fragile space, but real. And everyone present knew they would never forget the night when enemies chose humanity over fear. By dawn, the storm had eased into a soft drift of falling snow. The forest lay quiet, blanketed in white, as if trying to hide the scars left across its frozen floor. Smoke no longer curled from burning cottages. Artillery had fallen silent. And in the fragile calm, Sergeant Hayes stepped out of the barn, exhaling a breath that fogged gently before disappearing. The prisoners emerged behind him, no longer shaking from terror, though still weakened by exhaustion and cold. They walked slowly, gathering themselves, leaning on one another in the soft early light. Emile remained close, the canteen still held tightly in his grip. Not as a lifeline now, but as a symbol of a night he could hardly understand. Lieutenant Harris oversaw the preparations to transport the prisoners to the rear. The Americans spoke in hushed voices, exchanging glances at the unlikely peace that had unfolded mere hours earlier. None of them had imagined that the deadliest winter of the war would contain a night where no shots were fired, where rivals recognized each other as men rather than enemies. When the prisoners were lined up and ready to move, the German sergeant approached Hayes with deliberate steps. He paused, standing straight despite obvious fatigue. His eyes held the quiet sincerity of someone who had stared at death and been pulled back. "You could have let us die," he said softly, in hesitant English. Hayes didn't respond right away. The weight of the night, its choices, its risks, settled on his shoulders. "Wars killed enough people," he finally said. "Didn't need to take more." The German sergeant nodded once, deeply. A gesture of respect between men who had fought on opposite ends of the same frozen nightmare. As the column prepared to move, Emile lingered, looking back at the barn, then at Hayes. Snowflakes caught in his hair. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Instead, he lifted the canteen slightly and gave a small, grateful nod. Hayes returned it. A nod not of forgiveness, not of apology, just understanding. The prisoners were escorted toward the rear lines. Their silhouettes thinned into the white haze, fading like ghosts into the trees. Hayes watched until they were gone, until only the empty road and wind remained. The war would continue. The Bulge would bleed both sides before ending. Men would fight, fall, rise, and remember. Some would carry hatred. Some would carry grief. Some, like Hayes, carried a moment that proved humanity could still survive even in the coldest winter. That night in the barn would never be recorded in official reports. It would never appear in history books. Yet for the men who lived it, American and German, it became a memory powerful enough to outlast the war itself. A reminder that kindness could take root even in frozen ground. A reminder that mercy, once given, did not vanish. Years later, Hayes would return home, build a quiet life, work the fields his father once farmed. But on winter mornings, when snow dusted the horizon and cold settled into the earth, he would sometimes pause, feeling the past brush against the present. He would remember the barn, the fear, the decision, simple yet immense. He would remember a young German boy clutching a canteen with trembling hands. And he would remember how, for one night in a war defined by brutality, enemies stood in the same snow and chose not to kill. In that fragile silence, something human survived. And long after the guns stopped, the winter winds carried the echo of that moment. Soft, steady, unbroken. A reminder that even in war, mercy leaves a mark that does not fade.